Hi there. I am Gwen Raymundi, and for those who don't know me, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist associate in the state of Washington. I specialize in and focus on trauma, grief, and embodiment, and all of their intersections in my work, both in group work and individual. And that's my personal work for me, and my work for out in the world also. And this is the first in a four-part series on trauma and exploring trauma and the different aspects of it. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the different types of trauma, as well as the importance of having community in processing our trauma. I wrote an essay about this that goes with this video, and I give even more detail about the different types of trauma in the essay. If you're watching this on YouTube, the link to the essay is down at the bottom in the description. If you're watching this on my blog, you've read the essay, and if you came to this link from my newsletter, then you've also read the essay. But basically, I believe there are 3 or 4 different types of trauma that we have in our bodies and in our systems. The first is lived experience trauma, the trauma of our own lives, right? That can be abuse that we've experienced, be that sexual, physical, psychological, emotional. It can be surgeries. It can be car accidents. It can be, anything that we personally have experienced in our lives and are part of our own stories of who we are and where we come from. Though that type of trauma can come from either chronic or acute events. So chronic events are like our ongoing abuse. An acute event would be a one-time surgery or a single car accident or a one-time rape or mugging, right? Very singular events versus something that has been going on for years. There is also ancestral and intergenerational trauma. Often people mix these two together. They use the words interchangeably, ancestral and intergenerational. I think they are two separate things. I consider ancestral trauma to be anything that is passed down through our bloodline and shows up in the epigenetic markers of our DNA. It shows up as cellular memory. It is biological, our ancestral trauma, and it is passed down through the generations until we process it out of our systems, right? And then intergenerational trauma is also passed down through families. However, I see intergenerational trauma as more of the actions that we experience because of traumatic events that have happened to those in our family. It could be that a mother experiences a traumatic event, be that loss of a child, loss of a sibling, has her own abuse history, any and all of those things, right? And those events have impacted her and how she presents to the world, right? So she may have depression, anxiety, probably PTSD, right? Which affects how she's able to parent, which then would affect uh, our attachment relationships. It affects how we simply interact, right? How we are able to have relationships or not. So that is a part of intergenerational trauma, is those actions, the behaviors, the nurture aspect of our lives, right? Of being raised in families. There are also parts of intergenerational trauma that can be traced back to language. So there can be certain words that are really powerful within certain families that in other families they don't have the same power. It could be, any number of words. It could be lazy. It could be smart. It could be stupid. It could be, right? It doesn't really matter what the word is, but there is typically within families particular words or phrases that you can see through the generations are passed down and hold very powerful meaning within the family. So those are three of the four, and then the fourth is cultural trauma, or what I call cultural relational trauma. And this is the trauma of living in a culture that oppresses its people. So this is living in a white supremacist, a capitalist, an ableist, a misogynist, a homophobic, right, etc., patriarchal culture where there is a hierarchy and that there is only one particular type of good or okay person, and everyone else is less than in varying degrees. And the impacts of having to live in that culture, having to function in that culture, trying to figure out ways to survive in that culture can have a traumatic impact on us and our bodies and our beings. When we consider that there are these three or four, depending on if you see intergenerational and ancestral as two separate things, three or four different types of trauma that are out there, right? And that all of us have at least two or three of them, depending again on how we view intergenerational and ancestral trauma. We all have cultural trauma, and we all have the ancestral / intergenerational piece. Most of us have a lived experience trauma, at least one in our lives. And all of this impacts us. It impacts us physically, it impacts us emotionally, it impacts us psychologically. It impacts the way we are able to relate with other people. One of the impacts of trauma is to isolate us, is that when we have trauma living within us, we tend to isolate ourselves. We don't really want to be around people. People don't understand us. We're afraid of close relationships. They aren't safe, right? And so when we are able to come together in a community that is safe enough for us to start to process this work, to share our stories in a way where we aren't going to be gaslit, where we aren't going to be blamed, where we aren't going to be shamed, where we are going to be accepted as yes, and believed. Yes, this happened. Yes, this happened to you. Yes, we believe you. Yes, we hear you. And we're here, right? When we're able to have those kinds of communities, our healing, I'll talk about that in another in one of the other videos in this series. Our processing is able to happen, and we're able to start to move this and make our own shifts within ourself of then how we interact in the world, right? So this is all, this series is an introduction to the topics that we'll be exploring and working on in my trauma-informed embodiment level 1 program that begins February 1. And also to share with you that I am offering a sexual trauma support group that will also begin February 1 for people who need an online, will be online virtual through Zoom and on Facebook. For people who are looking for a small support group to talk about the things that have happened to them, to talk about how the current events that are happening are impacting us, and how that is bringing up our own trauma and how we are able to react with that. The trauma-informed embodiment level 1 is very specific for processing trauma, whereas the support group is really simply a support group. They are two different things, and you're welcome to be in both. There is limited space in each of them also, because I have found that small groups tend to be the best way to do this work. So if you'd like to learn more about either of those, there's also links down below. So I hope to connect with you again soon.